First, this is actually my first public event during Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And it's always a good moment for us to reflect on our culture, what progress we have made, as well as what challenges we face in this current moment. Second, it is also a special moment because this year marks the 35th anniversary of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And for 35 years, we have been fighting to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. It's also interesting because when our organization was first founded, one of our first reports was on Asian hate crimes against Asian Americans and how underreported that was. Unfortunately, 35 years later, though progress has been made, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And look, the clear reality is that anti-immigrant rhetoric is at an all-time high. It's at an alarming rate. And unfortunately, we currently have a president who is adding fuel to that fire. As Sunita said, just last week, the president reposted a rant from a far-right-wing radio host that called immigrants from India and China gangsters with laptops. He called those countries hellhole countries, which is reminiscent of how he has described other countries. That the rant also included how Asian Americans are disloyal to this country and that we somehow fail to integrate into this country as, quote, Europeans have in the past. And so this is part of the context that we need to remember. And I want to put this into a broader context, that this is also in the context of just last week, the Department of Justice filed a baseless criminal complaint against the Southern Poverty Law Center, a 50-year-old organization dedicated to preventing hate exposing white supremacist groups like the KKK, the Proud Boys, or the Oath Keepers. We also have a federal government that has canceled hate crime grants mid-contract, grants that actively are trying to prevent hate crimes and hate incidents. And they are pressuring social media companies to reduce their efforts to moderate hate content. So why does this matter? When we have a federal government that is not only failing to prevent hate incidents, but actively engaging in conduct and speech that incentivizes it, all of us, all Americans suffer. And what we have right now is a story of both progress and progress lost. So as everyone remembers, 5 years ago, as Sunita said, we were in the height of anti-Asian hate. And even as we were coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we again had President Trump during the pandemic talk about this as the China virus, the Wuhan flu, or the worst of those variations that he used was the Kung flu. And he literally laughed about it as campaign events. And as we all saw, anti-Asian hate was at a tremendous level, as documented by Stop AAPI Hate, among other organizations. And what we saw during that time was in March of 2021, 6 Asian American women murdered in Atlanta. We saw 4 Sikh Americans murdered at the FedEx shootings in Indianapolis. And so the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was passed. It was a timely response to what our communities were facing. And that law helped to create, among other things, non-law enforcement measures and avenues to report hate and to get help. It strengthened our infrastructure to respond to hate, including reporting access, language access, and AG coordination. It also supported providing grants to community organizations to prevent hate and talk about how we could respond to these incidents. And as Anita said, the current status is this. We do have a situation where we're moving backwards. We have a situation where hate crimes are still at alarmingly high rates. Now, I will be clear, it is not based on reported data at the same rate as it was from 2020 to 2022. But as Sunita said, it is almost triple of what it was at pre-pandemic levels. And in particular, I would note that even the reported hate crimes data that was provided by the FBI shows that anti-Sikh, anti-Hindu, and anti-Buddhist hate crimes are at the highest levels ever recorded by the FBI. Anti-Latino hate remains significantly high. It's been at the highest number reported in over a decade. Now, what this data also does not tell us is that hate crimes are still underreported. Part of this is because we have a patchwork infrastructure where there are organizations, there are government agencies that are not incentivized to report hate crimes and report hate incidents. We have people that are trying to minimize what is happening on the ground. And the reality is that people do not feel safe. These concerns are heightened by oppressive immigration enforcement and concerns over policing due to the Trump administration's reduction in oversight and how they look at DOJ. Now, part of this also is that the notion of who is an American is under attack through the administration's attempt to eliminate birthright citizenship. And they have directed this notion that somehow the white majorities are the people being discriminated against, and that's where the effort should be, rather than on inclusion, rather than on equity, rather than on diversity. The other thing is that this stereotype of us being perpetual foreigners, Asian Americans being perpetual foreigners that could never become American, has resurfaced, even though it has never gone away. And we have also, and this is where the Trump's repost of the right-wing radio host makes a difference, this notion that somehow we present a national security or economic security risk to the United States. We have seen this playbook before, whether it is during World War II with the incarceration of Japanese Americans, whether it is post 9/11 with the targeting of Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Americans, and even back to the Chinese Exclusion Act when Chinese railroad workers helped to produce the Transcontinental Railroad. I think this is the context in which Trump's posts and his language matters in making sure that we do not go back to a space where we see murders like we did in 2021. So what we need for state and local governments to stand up to help fill that void that is being presented by the federal government, whether it is with respect to reporting, whether it is with respect to grants, whether it is with respect to working with community organizations. Passage of legislation such as the Improving Reporting to Prevent Hate Act and making sure that congressionally appropriated money for community grants are actually distributed to community centers. Increased resources for state-run, non-law enforcement hate crime reporting hotlines and hate incident reporting hotlines, and continued services such as DOJ's Community Relations Service to help with what we are doing. We are in a crisis moment in many, many ways. At the same time, I am positive and optimistic that we can overcome this. We have seen these playbooks before. Our communities have responded to these playbooks before, and we just need to rise up and do that again. Thank you very much. I am happy to answer some questions.
And there are many questions for you, but John, I'm wondering if you could put this in a larger context. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court struck down Louisiana's congressional district map, which represented a largely Black congressional district. Is this an attempt to largely erase minority communities?
Thank you for that question, Sunita. That is absolutely correct. We have to put that voting rights decision in the context of everything else that is happening. We have a Supreme Court that is suggesting that the focus should be on, again, discrimination against the white majority, rather than what all of us are feeling, which the American public feels. When you look at public polling, everyone understands and agrees that discrimination against Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans is still the predominant form of discrimination. Nevertheless, we have a Supreme Court and parts of the federal legislature believe that that is not a problem. And again, when you have the sort of racially polarizing discussion that some are engaging in, it reverberates and it resounds into our community, into people viewing our community as less than or as less American.
Thank you. Let's take a question from Elena Kuzetnova of Slavic Stack. Elena, please ask your question.
Hi, Sunita. Thank you so much. I have two questions. So, first of all, what else do you think fuels hate besides the current administration's narrative, which is obviously very hateful, at least to me? And what other ways to reduce hate? Do you see besides the anti-hate programs, grants, initiatives? etc. Thank you so much.
Well, and sorry, I didn't quite catch the first question. So if you could repeat that, and then I definitely understood the second question.
I think Elena was asking
Yeah.
what fuels hate
Oh, fuels hate.
besides the current administration's narrative.
Yes. Thank you, Sunita. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of things, right? First is, again, sort of, yes, we are in currently with respect to the United States, there's a lot of people that are suffering, whether it's because of lack of health care, whether it's because of economic circumstances. The problem whenever you have that is there are organizations or there are elements that try to scapegoat a community for that. And currently, the scapegoating is of immigrants writ large, of which Asian Americans are a significant segment of that. So that is what is fueling a lot of this hate is people see America in a weird sort of way as diminishing, whereas I think all of us, I think I in some ways can speak for this group that is listening to this, we need to make sure we get out the message that America is, I will dare say, America is still great. We can be greater, but would be greater if we are inclusive, if we try to create more equity for those that are suffering. That is how we grow the country. The suggestion that the country is somehow limited, I think, is a false belief. And that's number one, how we need to have these discussions. And then to have these discussions within all of our different communities, even with those that may be skeptical or don't quite agree with us yet.
Thank you. Henrietta Burrows has the next question. Henrietta?
Thanks, Sunita. FBI statistics were quoted, and various government departments have shut down accurate reporting and the accurate keeping of statistics. And we know how the FBI is in lockstep with the current administration. So how credible now is the data compiled by the FBI? Since the Trump administration is minimizing hate crimes and doing everything possible to eliminate DEI programs and accurate reporting. Can we really trust those statistics?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, thank you for that question, Henrietta, and it's great to hear from you again. You are absolutely right, but I think this proves our point. Even under this data, which we know is minimalized, we know is underreported, we know that they're devoting no resources to, even that data shows elevated levels of hate crimes against all of our communities. So that in itself shows how bad it is. You are absolutely right, and all of us believe that this is severely underreported for a number of reasons that we've discussed. But even that severely underreported data shows how big of a problem this remains.
Carlos Roa has the next question. Carlos?
Well, we're supposed to have a system based in laws. So I would like to go back to the basics of laws. Our law system is failing. Where is it failing to witness America coming this far in the situation we're living now regarding the topic of this press conference?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually would push back a little bit to say that our system of laws are failing. I do think that the courts are doing what they can. And again, I have severe disagreements with the Supreme Court over the recent voting rights decision, over a number of decisions. At the same time, I do think that there are courts that are standing up. But the reality is that we have a federal government, especially the executive branch, that has a large bullhorn, and that can speak with such a loud microphone that it could feel overwhelming. So that is that is one weakness in the system right now. The second weakness in the system is how microphones are being used. And this is where, again, I would urge all of you to continue to report accurately about what is happening in all of our communities. Because we are, to use a term that I sometimes don't like using, We are being gaslit about what the problems are in the United States, suggesting that the problems are being caused by immigrants, the problems are being caused by other elements, by so-called radical leftists. The reality is like the problems are deeper than that in terms of economic justice, and this is where sort of we need to have honest discussions about this. So that is where I think responsible reporting by media, including social media, is so important to ensuring that we do come together as a country and have these honest discussions.
Thank you, John. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so via text, how do you view the public response in Minneapolis and its impact on wider public opinion about immigrants?
That's a great question, because if you look at what happened in Minneapolis and even how this administration had to back down, literally the head of ICE lost his job over this. It suggests that sort of like we as a community still have such a large voice. We as voters, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court decision said, still have a significant power in holding our elected officials accountable for their actions. So I take great hope, again, just as it was in 2021 after the Atlanta spa shootings and after Indianapolis. There were tragedies, but out of those tragedies did come progress. And out of the tragedies in Minneapolis, we saw communities stand up. Even if you look at the public polling, it used to be that Republicans, conservatives, Trump basically had positive polling around their view of immigration. That has completely flipped, such that the broad majority of Americans now believe that their policies towards immigration are headed in the wrong direction.
Interesting. John, one more question from Laszlo Bartis. It's a very important question. Laszlo, please ask your question.
Yes, hi. My question is, why is there a false belief that Asian Americans never fully become American? What is the reason? What can be done to reduce this misconception?
Thank you, Laszlo.
Look, I think part of the false belief is simply that we do not, and I'm going to be very transparent and direct about this, is because we look different, there is going to be a barrier that we need to overcome. Number two, though, is that I think we should recognize that we are in some ways the most recent immigrants to the United States. So, until the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1965, we were only 0.5% of the population. Now, 60 years later, we are 7% of the population, right? And so the fact that we are newer immigrants, I think, and I'm going to give a lot of grace here and empathy for older Americans, white Americans, we do look foreign, if you will. And I'm using the term foreign in just like not new or new. Just as Polish Americans, Italian Americans back in the earliest 20th century, Irish farmers after the potato famine in the late 19th century were viewed as people that could not assimilate. I am going to be optimistic in saying that if we continue to work, and that's not on us, look, the work is bilateral. It shouldn't just be on us to show how American we are. We should not be in a space that we need to be the model minority. I do not want us to simply say we need to keep our heads down to show that we are American. So it is just not only on us, but it is on us to help educate, continue to be in community with others to help them understand we have the same goals, we have the same ideals, we have the same values. That is what makes America, again, I am going to use the word, that is what makes America great, that we are a nation of ideals rather than a nation that is based on blood, based on ethnicity. And that has always been part of the fabric of America that has made us innovative, that has allowed us to grow.
Such inspiring remarks. Thank you so much, John. There are a number of questions for you in the chat. We won't get to all of them, but
And I can, what we can do is you could send them to me and we can answer them offline. I would be happy to do that. I would be happy to do that.
That's perfect. Thank you
Thank you.
once again.
Thank you. Take care, all.
All right. We will now pivot to a roundtable discussion with Manirmal Kaur, Samir Hossain, and Stephanie Chan, who will begin with some introductory remarks. First, let's welcome Manirmal Kaur of the Sikh Coalition. Welcome, Manirmal.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Really glad to be with you all. My name is Manirmal Kaur. I serve as the Senior Federal Policy Manager at the Sikh Coalition. The Sikh Coalition was founded almost 25 years ago in response to the wave of hate violence that was triggered by 9/11, as Americans conflated turbans and beards, which are articles of faith kept by many Sikhs, as well as other cultural and ethnic characteristics, with terrorism. One of the first deadly hate crimes after 9/11 was the murder of Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh man who was shot and killed outside of his gas station while planting flowers on September 15th in 2001 by a man who claimed to be seeking retribution for the terrorist attacks 4 days earlier. Mr. Sodhi's murder was one of over 300 cases of violence and discrimination against Sikhs in the United States that the Sikh Coalition documented in just the first month after 9/11 alone. I'll also note that anti-Sikh hate didn't even start with 9/11. Sikhs have been experiencing hate-motivated violence in the US for over a century. In 1907, violent mobs attacked Sikh immigrant mill workers in Bellingham, Washington, and ultimately ran the whole Sikh and South Asian community out of the area. So anti-Sikh hate is definitely not a new phenomenon in the United States. However, it is constantly evolving. I think racism, bigotry, and xenophobia, like John highlighted so beautifully, have featured prominently in mainstream politics and culture in recent years in new and alarming ways, right? The White House and federal agencies have uplifted white nationalist and neo-Nazi content on social media. Dozens of bills have been introduced and passed around the country attacking the very concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Small Business Administration has barred non-citizens from applying for loans. And politicians continue to exploit myths like the myth of widespread non-citizen voter fraud. And the White House is attempting to end birthright citizenship. So the impact of these bad faith, bigoted policies and rhetoric are felt by immigrants and communities of color across the country, including Sikhs. Thanks to Stop AAPI Hate and their wonderful data, we know that anti-South Asian hate surged online after the 2024 presidential election. And May and June of 2025 were the third and fifth highest months for violent threats against South Asians since 2023. Again, that's according to data from Stop AAPI Hate. The data for those months also showed a spike in the use of slurs, including a sharp increase in anti-Sikh language. So while anti-Sikh hate is certainly not a new phenomenon in the United States, I think it does evolve in ways that are important for us to keep track of and respond to so that we can identify the best ways to address it in all of the new and different forms that it can take.
Thank you, Ms. Kaur. Next up is Samir Hossain of MPAC. Samir, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking American Community Media and Asian Americans Advancing Justice for convening this timely briefing. I'd also like to wish everyone a very happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Again, my name is Samir Hossain. I'm with the Muslim Public Affairs Council, or MPAC for short, and I serve as their managing director in the Washington, D.C. office. And I'll share more about this organization in my remarks. I'm going to build off of what my colleagues Sunita, John, and Manirmal have already shared with you. I'll try not to repeat anything they've said, but very much agree with what's been discussed. For many years, we've consistently seen a year-to-year rise in hate-fueled bias, harassment, discrimination, and violence across the United States, especially against members of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Even the best data, as already mentioned, is a gross undercount and gives us insufficient insight into the daily indignities faced by many underrepresented and underserved communities. None of this is new, as Manirmal just mentioned, and certainly predates 9/11, but the environment in which this is all taking place right now is rapidly evolving and escalating. I'd like to illustrate with a few stories from the American Muslim perspective in particular, as MPAC has observed through our engagements with communities across America. So I'll share two short stories and I'll tie them into our discussion today, which of course will be self-evident. The first one is just 10 days after the 9/11 attacks, on September 21, 2001, a man walked into a gas station in Dallas, Texas, and asked the cashier, "Where are you from?" Mr. Racebunya, confused, responded, "Excuse me?" Without any further words exchanged, Mark Stroman shot Racebunya in the face with a shotgun at point blank range. Years later, Race would say that it felt like a million bees stinging his face. But the two other victims that day of the shooter's killing spree would not live to tell their own stories. While on death row, the shooter said he was targeting Muslims and Arabs to get revenge for the September 11 attacks. Now, to tie it to our conversation, Race is Muslim, but of Bangladeshi descent. The deceased from that day were Vasudev Patel, an Indian immigrant and Hindu, and Waqar Hassan, a Muslim originally from Pakistan. They were all of South Asian descent and had nothing to do with 9/11. And Manirmal just mentioned one of the first people we know of who was killed after 9/11, who was from the Sikh community. And so in this incident in Dallas, before their killer was executed in 2011, Race actually went on an international campaign to seek clemency for the perpetrator. And he said ignorance is what led to those hate crimes, and mercy is the only way to cultivate a world without hate, a belief rooted in his Islamic faith. Fast forward to October 2023, just 1 week after the horrific attacks in Israel, hate arrived on the doorstep of a Muslim Palestinian American family in the outskirts of Chicago. On the morning of October 14, 2024, the landlord, Joseph Chuba, forced his way into his tenant's home. As he attacked Miss Hanan Shaheen, he yelled, "You Muslims must die," while expressing anger about the October 7th attacks. Using a knife, he seriously injured Miss Shaheen, who hid in the bathroom and called 911. When she emerged, she found her sweet little 6-year-old boy Wadia gravely wounded by the attacker. His last words to his mother were, "Mom, I'm fine." Wadia was pronounced dead shortly after at the hospital. His killer was sentenced to 53 years for murder and hate crimes. He later died while in prison. I share these stories to explain kind of what happens in these incidents, and many of you are familiar with both of the stories I shared. But for the most part, as already discussed, these are not reported, and we really have to get to the bottom of why. We've talked about those post 9/11 attacks. I just gave an example of something that happened right after the October 7th attacks, and these waves just keep happening. They certainly happen against the Muslim American community, but all communities because of that otherizing of various communities that are often underrepresented across, our society and in different levels of government. And so what I want to share today is what my organization, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, is actually doing. We have a center called the Center for Security, Technology, and Policy, and we've documented in the past month an 11-fold increase in the number of attacks against American Muslims and mosques in comparison to all previous months that we've been tracking. And this comes in the context of elected officials saying those things that we've already discussed, and particularly against Muslims and Islam, saying that Muslims don't belong here, Islam is not compatible with American values, and that Muslims should be deported and denaturalized. And so this is all happening simultaneously, which leads us to question, why is this happening? And that's already been discussed a little bit before I came on. There are many incidents of hate and violence that I could describe, and I'd like to get into those in the Q&A, but I want to address why incidents are not reported. And this has been discussed a little bit, but I'd like to offer 3 examples of why. First, communities are unaware of what to report and how to do so. Access to this information remains very limited, whether due to language barriers or insufficient community outreach by relevant law enforcement agencies. Second, there's a trust deficit between communities and law enforcement agencies, and I'm happy to get into why that's the case. And third, many who do report say there's a lack of responsiveness. They'll say they reported a hate crime or hate incident through official channels and just never heard back, which makes them less inclined to report in the future. And so I'll close with what I think the solutions are. First is be informed. At MPAC and through the center I mentioned on security and technology policy, We're collecting data about anti-Muslim hate, creating community-focused resources, and holding regular briefings to identify trends and the actions MPAC is taking through policy advocacy and coalition building. And I'll drop a chat so everyone can access that information. Second, find ways to build a relationship with local law enforcement contacts. As an advocacy organization, we're trying to be that facilitator. We just recently launched a security bulletin to encourage community leaders to be informed about what's happening and then what they can do about it, which includes building those relationships with local police departments and engaging with other faith-based institutions and community organizations to understand how they report hate incidents. And lastly, I'd like to encourage everyone to engage your local elected officials. This can be a difficult task for many communities, but if you work with, community advocates and organizations, you can get those conversations going. MPAC is certainly prioritizing that. And again, I will drop some of those resources so that you know how we are doing that. Lastly, my appeal to everyone, please report every single incident. If you're in immediate danger, always dial 911. Otherwise, please find ways to report every single incident, whether you reach out to law enforcement directly or work through those community advocates. And again, I'm about to drop those links in the chat to see how you can do that. I thank all the members of the press for playing a critical role in highlighting these issues and to inform the public. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Samir, thank you so much. Finally, we move to Stephanie Chan of Stop AAPI Hate for introductory remarks. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Sunita, and thank you to my fellow panelists and all the reporters who have joined us today. Stop API Hate tracks anti-Asian and anti-Pacific Islander anti-AAPI hate in 3 ways. You've heard about some of them. First, through our online reporting portal, where anyone who experiences or witnesses an act of anti-AAPI hate can report it. Second, every year we conduct an annual survey, and it's a large and representative survey on experiences of anti-AAPI hate with NORC at the University of Chicago. And third, we work with a group called Moonshot to track anti-AAPI slurs and threats of violence in online spaces associated with targeted violence, such as 4chan and X. Whereas FBI data is limited to hate crimes, and we know the FBI data even on hate crimes is limited, our data tracks hate acts, which includes both hate crimes and non-criminal hate incidents. By tracking both, we're able to get a fuller, more nuanced picture of how AAPIs are being impacted by racism. Since starting our survey in 2023, we have found that anti-AAPI hate has remained consistently high and widespread. Each year, including in 2025, and we just released this data today, half of AAPI adults surveyed said they experienced a hate act due to their race, ethnicity, and nationality. And a lot of this is intersectional with anti-religious hate, which the 2 other speakers have talked about. From the stories submitted to our online reporting center from 2020 to 2025, we have seen a shift from hearing attackers blaming Asian people for COVID to now saying things like, Trump should deport you. So we know they are being emboldened by the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies of this administration. For example, a Korean woman in California said that she was at a fast food restaurant when a woman got into her face and screamed, I can't wait until Trump deports you like he promised, and then physically shoved her. In another report, a multiracial Pacific Islander man who was online said that someone told him that they are reporting him to ICE, even though he is a US citizen, and he should get his papers ready. From our tracking of online hate, we have seen a steady rise in anti-South Asian slurs, particularly in surges, that it surges with moments of South Asian visibility, policy attention, and high-profile events. For example, when Kamala Harris, Usha Vance, and Zohran Mamdani entered the political spotlight, and also when there were major debates among politicians and influencers on the right about H-1B visas. FBI data is incomplete because not all law enforcement agencies submit data. Moreover, as Samir and others have mentioned, Asian and Pacific Islander people tend to underreport hate. In our survey, we found that only 22% of those who experienced a hate act reported it to a formal authority. And oftentimes it's because they have little confidence that anything will be done if they report it. So what we see is just continued widespread, hate that has not subsided since it began and since the surge began with COVID. But we know that it also goes back further historically. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, we'll start with a couple of questions from me, and then we'll go to questions from reporters. So for all speakers, there have been numerous reports of data sharing amongst law enforcement agencies and federal immigration agencies. Have any of you seen a decline in hate crime and incident reporting in your communities as immigrants fear becoming visible to agencies and possible immigration repercussions? 30 seconds to each of you. Samir.
Yes, absolutely. To answer your question, I don't think it caused anyone to stop reporting. It just made them more fearful, so less likely than ever before to report. And we just met with law enforcement and we asked, would you enforce immigration laws if somebody came to you as a victim of a crime? They said, absolutely not. We don't cooperate with the Department of Homeland Security and ICE on immigration. Everyone should report. And we went back to the community and shared that with them.
Stephanie, how would you respond?
Yes, I mean, we've seen consistent underreporting, and I would not be surprised in places where law enforcement cooperates with ICE that people would be scared. If I report this, am I going to get caught in the immigration dragnet? We have seen that half of AAPI said they or an AAPI person they know personally have been impacted by the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. And this includes being fearful of deportation, arrest, and detention, being fearful that their status will be questioned. So we have seen a decline, and I definitely think part of the reason why is this fear of surveillance.
Thank you. Manir.
Yep. So I think for us, because there are so many factors that go into whether or not someone reports a hate crime to the SIT Coalition, including whether they know about the SIT Coalition and know what kind of services we provide, it can be really difficult to definitively extrapolate the reasons behind the ebb and flow of our intake numbers. But like my colleague said, I think when you look at everything that this administration is doing to box certain communities out of public life, essentially, and limit their access to essential services, I think it is hard to imagine that those efforts wouldn't inevitably be having an impact on communities like ours.
Thank you. And this next question is for you as well. On August 5th, 2012, neo-Nazi Wade Michael Page stormed a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, killing 7 people before committing suicide. What has changed for the Sikh community in the 13 years since that tragic event, and how is the community safeguarding itself against future mass shootings?
In some ways, I think since 2012, we have seen positive policy change, right? In 2015, for example, the FBI started tracking hate crimes motivated by anti-Sikh bias. So we now get those numbers every year from the FBI. However, there's a lot of work to be done using that same example of FBI data. It's not mandatory for local law enforcement agencies to report to the FBI. So like folks have already highlighted, that data is still almost certainly an undercount. As far as how we safeguard ourselves against mass shootings, as a civil rights organization, one of the most important things we can do to help keep our community safe is hold the government accountable and make sure that it's meeting its obligations to our community. For example, there is a program called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, under which DHS provides grants to entities like houses of worship. Sikh Gurdwaras have utilized this program that are looking to improve their security infrastructure to protect against these kinds of attacks. And so making sure that DHS is fulfilling its obligations under that program, which it fell short of last year, and also advocating for gun violence prevention policy to keep guns out of the hands of folks with, for example, recorded histories of bias-based violence. Those are things that I think we have an obligation to do.
Thank you. Samir, are you seeing an increase in hostility towards Muslims amid the US-Israel-Iran war and also amid the Palestine conflict?
Yes, Sunita, thank you. Absolutely on both counts. Impact just released a report on April 15th about the Iran war. It's entitled The Pitfalls of Operation Epic Fury, how the undeclared war against Iran hurts Americans. And we go into a lot of detail about this issue. I will drop a link to it, but we highlight the anti-Muslim sentiment coming from elected officials and also potentially establishment clause violations by senior officials when they talk about this war in religious terms. And what we've seen is there's been an 11-fold increase in attacks against Muslims and their institutions in March of this year in comparison to all previous months. And what we're trying to do is identify why that's the case, hold our elected officials accountable, work with law enforcement, and we've created a community guide, which I've already linked to, but I'll share again, which explains what people can do in order to stay safe and to advocate for their, constitutionally protected rights. With respect to the ongoing conflict in Palestine, we have seen ongoing issues here in the United States as a result. There's generally three trends we've seen. It's a sharp rise in harassment and threats targeting Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian Americans. And then second, there's increasing pressure on speech. So a lot of people are either being disciplined or facing problems in the workplace, or they're self-censoring. And I think that that's a huge concern for us. And third, there's just this growing sense of fear and isolation in communities, causing them to step back from political and social life, which I think is grossly, unappreciated. These issues affect us all and really get to the core of our democracy and our rights as citizens and our rights as individuals under international law. So these are things we really need to all be paying attention to. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie, Stop the AAPI Hate is releasing a report today titled Closing Doors, Widening Harms. Could you share some of the key findings from that report?
Yes,
and then
absolutely.
reporters, we're going to go on to questions from you all.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Sunita, for lifting up our report, which just dropped today, and you can find it on our website, and hopefully we can share links with you as well. It was a nationally representative survey of about 1,400 AAPI adults about what they experienced in 2025. And as I mentioned, we found that half said that they had experienced a hate act in 2025, and there were not significant differences among East, South, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islanders. So about half of all of those groups had experienced a hate act in the past year. We did see that the prevalence of hate targeting Pacific Islander adults rose from 47% in 2024 to 57% in 2025. The most common types of hate people experienced were harassment and institutional discrimination. And it's noteworthy that it's not hate crimes, which just means that we need to address this broader range of hate that people are experiencing. As I mentioned, about half of AAPI adults also said they or an AAPI person they know personally, like a friend or family member, has been impacted by anti-immigrant sentiment and policies. And, just building off of what Samir said, some of this is that people are disengaging from public life. They are disengaging with civic engagement because of the fears surrounding immigration today. And we found that hate greatly impacted AAPI adults' mental health. For example, 73% of AAPI adults who experienced hate reported feeling stressed versus just 54, well, that's still high though, right? 54% of those who did not experience hate. But there is a big gap for those who did and did not experience hate. And only a third got any support. And many of these people said that support was insufficient. On the brighter side, 67% of API adults said they were motivated to advance equity and justice for our communities. However, participation in acts of resistance have dropped from 74% in 2023 to 56% in 2025. And that, like Samir has said, is super concerning for us because people do seem to be going more into hiding, do seem to be withdrawing from civic engagement and political engagement. And yet this is the time when we need that the most.
Okay, in the interest of time, I will ask Jungwon's question. As we mark the 5th anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, I'm concerned about a continued lack of federal and its significant engagement and its significant delay in the administration of justice since the Trump administration has taken over, while a trial for the shooter has yet to begin. What steps can be taken to ensure that hate crimes against the AAPI community in the Deep South are actually, looked into by federal and local law enforcement?
Yeah, there is just a great book that came out. That is, I'm trying to find it on my, oh yeah, here we go. It's called American Peril. And I would suggest that everyone read this book because what it shows is that the justice system has always been broken, right? It's actually not just the Trump administration, although it's probably more broken than it usually is. But so more often than not, hate crimes are not prosecuted, right? Because it's hard to bring evidence and enough evidence. And oftentimes throughout history, that evidence has been ignored or dismissed, especially as, juries can be racist as well. So there is a fundamental problem with our justice system. And so that's why Stop API Hate really advocates for finding solutions other than just law enforcement, especially at the federal level. There's a lot that we can do at the state level. We can reinforce our civil rights infrastructure at the state levels. We can hold leaders accountable at the state level and local levels, but we can also pursue community-based solutions that deal with prevention, the accountability piece, and hopefully restorative justice methods, as well as healing. Because one thing, even though, what we've seen is that it always doesn't quite feel sufficient, even if a hate crime charge is brought, because that family, who's been affected is still suffering. And yet none of the solutions that are strictly from law enforcement will address that healing. So it's very important to look into programs that not just deal with the person who attacked, but also the people who have been impacted by the harm.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sushmita Iyer. Sushmita, welcome, and please ask your question.
Hi, Sunita, and hello to all the speakers. My name is Sushmita, and I'm reporting this for India Currents. My question is, do you think awareness campaigns and having cultural representation programs in public schools can actually help understand the diversity in this country? Because I belong to the South Asian community. I'm a mom of two, and I know how the children in public school sometimes can be a bit mean towards children from the South Asian community, because they don't understand the culture, they don't understand the food that we eat. So, do you think these programs can really help understand the children in public school to see us as one of their own and not see us from a different lens? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Manirma, why don't you take that question on?
Sure. Such an important question. The Sikh Coalition's legal team frequently gets intakes from the families of Sikh students who have faced oftentimes egregious bullying in schools. And, that is anti-Sikh hate. It's bullying, but it is also religion-based harassment, and it's being faced by our kids. It is very common for Sikhs, for South Asians. We've also seen, that there are Sikhs who face that kind of harassment, not just from their peers, but from teachers and principals in schools as well, which is, I think, abhorrent. That's why I think one of the most important parts of our work is, we have a whole education team that is in part devoted to advocating for Sikhi to be included in social studies curriculums in states across the country, in lessons on world religions. I think that's one of the most important parts of our work, to kind of help address bias and hateful kind of mindsets before or as they are setting in. We also did a study, I think it's been 2 years now, on anti-Sikh bullying in schools, and found that in schools where Sikhi is included in the social studies curriculum, students report less bullying. So I think it is so important to recognize education and schools as kind of the forefront of where anti-hate work can be done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kaur.
Thank you. The next question comes from Fatma Bucket, and it's a question for Samir Hossain. I will ask it for you in the interest of time. Fatma asks, Samir, What stories, patterns, or issues do you think deserve much more attention right now? How can news media outlets better hold institutions accountable while still informing and protecting communities? How can our communities best support organizations like Impact?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, Fatima. I'm sorry we couldn't hear from you directly. I think number one, certainly, really tell the stories of our lived experiences of all of our communities. I think that's the part that often gets missed, and it is an educational tool, but also to share that we are a part of the fabric of this country. It is the 250th anniversary of America. Many, if not all of our communities have been here in some shape or form even before the founding of our country. And I think it would be a really opportune moment to celebrate that heritage and share with our fellow Americans that we are just part and parcel, again, of the fabric of this country. And, our country was founded on the principle of certainly equality for all, but religious freedom for everybody. And this is just the right time to share those stories and really uplift all of our communities. On a slightly less positive note, I think it's really important to highlight some of the things that don't get, classified as hate acts, even in the broad way that Stephanie described. So what we talked about is the chilling effect on speech. How does that manifest? Let's get those stories out there that people are choosing not to engage and really flesh out why that is so critical to push back against. We should encourage everyone to speak freely and protect that right. And certainly, as a part of an advocacy organization, I think people should stay informed, sign up for our newsletter, get involved in our organization. And I know all the other ones represented here, we're always encouraging people to join with us and work collectively. And of course, support our work. That's what makes all of this possible. So thank you for that excellent question.
How likely are incidents of a hate crime actually prosecuted? We followed a Filipino family that was attacked, and the judge maintained that it didn't rise to the level of a hate crime. This family was verbally and physically attacked. And that actually is a question that I had for all speakers. Why does law enforcement seldom identify a hate crime as such? Let's give each of our panelists 30 seconds to answer that question. What difficulties have you experienced with getting DAs to add hate crime enhancements to an incident? Samir, why don't you start?
Sure, and I know my colleagues here will have a lot more specificity here, but I think the part I'd like to highlight is to investigate a charge of a hate crime, you have to prove specific intent and bias, motivation beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high bar. And I think the way Stephanie described it in terms of hate acts is really what the community wants to see, to look at the full scope of what's happening, what's being said, what's being done. And they want assurances that law enforcement takes these issues seriously. And so when it doesn't meet that high threshold, it almost seems from the outside that it's falling through the cracks, even though law enforcement agencies will tell you that they take every crime seriously, that there's other charges that rise to a much higher level, especially if it's something like, first degree murder, right? That's where the hate crime enhancement is really unnecessary here. But I do want to turn it over to my colleagues to put a finer point on that.
Yeah, I think there are many reasons why hate crimes are not always categorized or identified as hate crimes. I know for the Sikh community, and I imagine it applies to others as well, it's a lack of awareness of the Sikh identity, right? An officer responding to a report of a Sikh who had their turban ripped off might not think to investigate that as a potential hate crime if they don't know that turbans are an article of faith for Sikhs. There may also be language and cultural barriers between victims or survivors and the responding officers, which can make it difficult to just even communicate the facts of what happened and what was said during an assault. It could also be, prosecutorial hesitation, right? Prosecutors and law enforcement might not even 100% understand the factors of hate crime statutes in their state. Maybe their state is a mixed motive state, which means that, the term that I use to refer to a state where a hate crime can be designated as a hate crime, even if it wasn't the only motivation behind the assault. If a prosecutor doesn't know that that's what their hate crime statute is, they might think it would just be easier to bring a different charge, where I'm more likely to get a conviction. So I think, we have a responsibility to identify these barriers and find ways to make sure that that hate crimes are identified as such. But I also think it's important, like Stephanie said, to advocate for policy changes that are kind of more preventative and maybe non-carceral as well.
Yeah, Stephanie, any weigh-ins here?
Yeah, I'll just share a story that we received, and you can see how it can be hard for people to identify something as related to bias or bias motivated. So, someone reported to us that a person yelled at them, "Go back to China, dog and cat eater, Chinese ching ching," and then continued to harass her days later. When she filed a police report, the officer said, "Go back to your country didn't count as racism." And she said she was left feeling unprotected and disheartened by the lack of seriousness in how the police handled this hate incident. So we can see there are problems with identification. There are problems because police only really receive reports of hate crimes and not things like hate incidents, which cause people to be very frustrated. But there are ways in which government agencies can take hate incidents seriously. And there are some of these efforts, like in California, we have a hotline for hate incidents where anyone can report, and then people know, hey, they're taking this incident seriously, even if it's not a hate crime, and connecting people with resources. So there are good examples of how we can address hate outside of the law enforcement system where we do see a lot of these gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to end with a question for all three of you, which Sushmita had actually brought up earlier. What kinds of supports can people offer to people who have experienced a hate crime or incident, or even as they're seeing it unfold? Stephanie, let's start with you since you're on.
Oh, please definitely tell them to report to us. We try to do a follow-up call with everyone who gives us permission. And part of it is just very empathetic listening. So if any of you hear of someone who has experienced hate, please just take a moment to affirm, yes, that was racism. Yes, that was a terrible thing that happened to you. And try to connect them to places of support, which we can help with as well. So definitely it's about supporting people, listening to their story, educating them, connecting them to larger resources that can support them.
Thank you. Samir?
Just to add, if you're seeing something happening, please don't be a passive bystander. Call 911 immediately. And again, everything Stephanie said. And I know it's very hard for people to reach out to law enforcement, right? Especially in this political and social environment. So reach out to, community leaders. If you're part of a faith-based community, reach out to your faith institutions and they can hopefully connect you. And of course, with the Muslim Public Affairs Council, we want everyone to be safe. So no matter your background, please reach out to us as well. And we have a broad coalition of faith-based partners and, civil rights organizations. And we work directly with the government at all levels and with law enforcement of every type to press upon them, to hold them accountable and make sure they're doing their part. So consider us a resource and we're all in this together this is how we're going to solve these very challenging problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Manirmal.
Second everything that that everyone else has already said. I think it's great advice. I think reporting when you can, even if you're hesitant to report to law enforcement, you can report to our organizations. If you report to the Sikh Coalition, everything you tell us is confidential, and we don't take any action, unless we get the okay of the person who we're advocating for. So making sure to report. And like Stephanie said, just being there to be empathetic and to listen. To the person who this has happened to, I think is so critical. And in the moment, I would say, it can be so situation specific what the best thing to do is. I think most importantly, whatever feels like it would help your safety and the safety of whoever might be experiencing it, is the best thing to do. Whether that's intervening and saying, I see what's happening and you need to stop, or whether it's recording and just being there and being present. I think it's very situation dependent, but knowing that there are organizations like ours who are there, after the fact to help advocate for whoever has experienced it, I think that's important.